Okay, so now we are going to open it up for Q&A.
All right, so the idea that I've put thought into this is perhaps an optimistic one, but as you might imagine, you've been a topic of conversation on this campus a lot in the past week or so, certainly among a lot of us who discuss politics, and one of the things that sort of united people who like and dislike a lot of your ideas is that we appreciate your defense of free speech, and we appreciate you coming here to talk about it with us. But one of the things I thought was really interesting is Professor Van Dyke addressed the distinction between you and Jonathan Haidt. And you mentioned this as sort of a temperamental one. And I think, I'm sure that's true to some extent, but I noticed you've made a lot of more sort of substantively inflammatory claims. Like in the course of this lecture, you called the authors of Facebook posts demons and totalitarians. In past events, you've called them things like neo-Marxists, cultural Marxists. You've called them, I believe, a fifth column that is committing treason against the West. And it seems to me this is more than temperamental. This is a substantive difference. And
it's a substantive difference,
and,
yes.
And another thing you've done is that, unlike Haidt, you have a more sort of comprehensive political program. You've talked a lot in defense of traditional hierarchies, both of gender, of class, so on, though emphatically not of race. And so it seems that
I haven't talked about defense of traditional hierarchies in terms of gender and class. That's not true.
Well, you've talked about hierarchies in society. You've talked
Yeah,
about
that's
yes.
true. I have done
would you
that,
not define
but I
that as
haven't
class?
justified them on the basis of gender and class.
You
whatever it
well,
the two
okay,
categories.
but you talk
not
about,
okay. That's an important
yes,
distinction.
Okay, but you defend hierarchies in society in a way that you talk a lot about the Pareto distribution, yes?
That doesn't mean I defend it.
Well, okay.
No, not well,
yes.
okay.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think you talk
Observing that something exists is
Yes.
not the same as defending it. How in the world?
Well, people attack it, right?
What's that?
And you don't. People attack it.
Attack
as
what?
inherently attack the hierarchies of society as inherently unjust, right?
Well, they're unjust, but
Yes.
they're also useful.
Okay, so you say they're useful. Some
Well,
people would disagree
look at
with
it
that
this way.
proposition.
Okay, look at it this way. You obviously think that it's worthwhile to stand up and ask a question.
Yes.
So you think that standing up and asking a question is better than
Yes.
not standing up and asking a question.
Yes.
Okay, that's a hierarchy
Yes.
of values.
Yes.
Okay, without the hierarchy of values, you couldn't act.
Of course.
No, not of course.
Well, wait.
It's
do you-
partly why
I
I'm
think
defending
there's
the
a distinction
hierarchy.
here.
Without
no
a
one
hierarchy,
disagrees
there's
about
no
the
impetus
facts
to
of the
act.
hierarchy, right?
What's that?
There is a hierarchy in society, right?
No, there's multiple hierarchies
Okay, there are
in
multiple
society.
hierarchies in society, right?
Yes.
And you say that they are based in, you invoke the lobster, right? That they are based in nature.
I
Yes?
said that they were inevitable.
Yes, that they were inevitable. Some
Right,
people
that
disagree
doesn't
with
mean that they're
but,
good.
But my point is that, this is generally relevant to it, you have a broader point than free speech. This is one of the things you talk about, yes?
Yes.
Okay. Whereas I think there are some other activists who focus on more exclusively
I'm not
on
an
free speech.
activist.
There's some other individuals who engage in public political speech. Okay.
Yeah?
Who focus more exclusively on free speech, whereas you have other goals in mind. But one of the things that your more inflammatory language, and it's fair, it's a substantive disagreement, has done, I think, is it's politicized this free speech to an extent that someone like Haidt hasn't. I've noticed that when someone hears the term free speech now, they associate it with a specific set of thinkers, often as viewed as on the extreme right. And I think arguably that's the problem of all factions in society, because free speech should be a universal value. Polls certainly suggest that it's coming under increasing threat from both sides. But I suppose the heart of my question, in addition to, of course, these other observations, is that do you believe free speech is your primary end, or do you believe these other points you're making are important? Because I've heard you a bunch of times defend free speech sort of contextually, like you've complained about some of the laws in Canada that you dislike, that they institutionalize false facts into the law. But it seems to me that an absolutist defense of free speech makes no preference as to true or false. The point is that something, you are being forced to say something. It would be as bad as if you were forced to say something that is true, because the point of free speech is that you can say whatever you want, right?
No,
And-
the point of free speech is so that you can think your way through
Yes.
life without running like
But
headlong
being
into a
told
brick
to
wall.
think position A versus position B is just as bad, right? Even if one is true and the other is not.
Okay, well, there was a bunch of questions.
Yes.
Good job, by the way.
Well, actually, wait, can I just ask one additional addendum? Which is, I think the politicization of free speech is by far the biggest threat to free speech, because this has always
No,
been...
the radical leftists are the biggest threat
Well,
to free
okay,
speech.
so this is a disagreement.
But I get your
as
point.
The professor alluded to in previous questions, the substantive threats to free speech in much of the world, in Europe certainly, I think in the United States as well, from the government have come from the radical right. And I think it's fair to say that on the specific narrow subset of certain departments on liberal arts colleges, it's fair to say a threat comes from the left, though its scope is in dispute. But my question is, do you think that the way you talk about free speech, the way you link it to specific issues, the way you use inflammatory language, and the way you seem to make it, you seem to defend a specific set of free speech. There are certainly plenty of instances of free speech attacked on the other side that you don't mention as much. Do you think you risk politicizing this? Because it seems to me
yes.
that, okay, and do you not think that's a far greater threat? Because, for example, the NRA, well, sorry, the NRA is a group in the United States that defends guns rights, right?
Okay, hold it.
Yes.
We need a question.
Yes. Okay.
I mean, like I said, you're doing fine, but it's just too much.
Yes.
Like, I can't keep it straight.
Do you think that your behavior risks politicizing it, and do you think that politicization is justified?
I think my behavior risks politicizing it, yes. I would rather it not be politicized. And I'm doing what I can to manage that risk. However, it's become political in my country because the government implemented compelled speech legislation. So I wasn't complaining about that before it became political. Now, and there is a time, even when you're detached in some sense from the political realm, that you can't be detached anymore. Well, I'm not happy with the fact that this has become politicized. You could say that I haven't done a stellar job in ensuring in every possible manner that this has remained neutrally apolitical. Probably true, you know, but I'm not particularly unhappy with the way things have gone so far. So, and I'm not happy with the radical left. And so, if they're irritated at me, so much the better, as far as I'm concerned. So, have I conducted myself perfectly? It's like, undoubtedly no. So, I've got more than my fair share of faults, and a temper is one of them. But I'm muddling through.
Hi, Professor. Yeah, thank you for your talk. I'd like to find out from you, what's your view of institutional racism? Is it a thing, or is it some other radical leftist agenda?
Say, I didn't quite catch the first part of that.
What's your view of institutional racism, or systematic racism, as some people may call it?
Institutional system.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is it a thing? Is it an actual thing, or is it some other agenda that you might attribute to radical leftists?
It's a multivariate problem, right? Like, no society is without its biases and prejudices, and some of them get built into the systems themselves. And so when you look at unequal outcomes and you're trying to discover why those unequal outcomes exist, if you have any sense, then you do a multivariate analysis and you put in prejudice and discrimination as one of the factors. One of the factors. One of many, many factors. And what the problem with the radical leftists is that they take the fact that societal structures are tyrannical to some degree and arbitrary, which of course they are because they're imperfect, and then they obliterate the rest of the complexity with that claim. So there's lots of reasons for inequality. Systemic bias is one of them. To what it's an open question to what degree systemic bias plays in the inequality problem, let's say. But it's something that we could hypothetically address with a certain degree of detachment and intelligence. So no system is perfect. Not, and certainly not ours. Reasonable? Reasonable answer? Okay.
Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. So I was watching a few of your interviews in preparation for this, and I heard you speak about religion quite a bit. And if you look up what religion means in the Webster Dictionary, you get something like a system of faith centered on a supernatural being or beings or something like that. But I've heard you use religion to describe things like punk rockers, for example, that's a religious experience. So my first question would be, how do you define what is considered religious? And then sort of as a follow-up to that, if, say, Sam Harris...
Religious is what you act out.
What's that?
Religious is what you act out.
Anything you act out.
Everything you act out is predicated on your implicit axioms. And the system of implicit axioms that you hold as primary is your religious belief system. It doesn't matter whether you're an atheist or not. That's just surface noise.
So it has nothing to do with divinity or
No, I didn't
supernatural
say that.
beings?
No.
Or it doesn't necessarily have to do with those?
No, it probably necessarily has to do with it too, but it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with your voluntarily articulated statements about whether or not you believe in something like a transcendent deity. So, I mean, what you act out is much more what you are than what you say about yourself. And what the hell do you know about what you believe anyways? You're complicated, man.
It's a fair question.
Well, seriously, people are complicated. You know, like we're not transparent to ourselves at all. That's why we have to go to university and study psychology. It's like, you know, we're not exactly black boxes, but we are the most complicated things there are, right? And we can't even program our VCR clocks. So it's like, how the hell can we propose to understand ourselves? And, you know, I'm existentially oriented, which is to say that I think that what you hold to be true is best determined as a consequence of an analysis of your actions rather than as a consequence of an analysis of what you purport to believe. Now, in order to act, you can't act without a hierarchy of value, which I tortured the other poor questioner about. You can't act without a hierarchy of values, because you can't act unless you think one thing is better than another. Because why would you act otherwise? So that means that you're embedded within a hierarchy of values, whether you know it or not, or maybe multiple fragmentary and competing hierarchies of value, which is all the worse for you, by the way, because it just makes you very confused. That hierarchy of values has an axiomatic, it's based on axioms. And the probability that you understand them is very low, because generally people don't understand their axioms. But that axiomatic system is essentially your religious system. And there's no way out of that as far as I can tell. And you can say, well, it isn't predicated on conscious belief in a transcendent deity. It's like, okay, have it your way. But, you know, most people in this room act out a Judeo-Christian ethic. And not only do they act it out, if they're treated in a manner that's not commensurate with that ethic, they get very, very, very annoyed. So, for example, if I fail to treat you as if you're an embodiment of a divine fragment, let's say, that's characterized by the ability to make free choice and to determine your own destiny in some sense, or if I fail to treat you as if you're a valued contributing member of the polity as a sovereign individual, then you'll find that very offensive and become angry. It's like, okay, then that's what you believe. Well, if I ask you if you believe any of that, well, that's a whole different story. You might give me some radical leftist nonsense. But that doesn't take away from what you've... that doesn't take away from the fundamentals of your action.
As one final thing. So when you and, say, Sam Harris argue about religion, you're arguing about fundamentally different things, it sounds like. His conception of what is religious is very different from yours.
Yeah, well, he tends to think of religious thought the same way that a smart 13-year-old atheist thinks about a fundamentalist Christian. It's like, yeah, okay, you're just not getting to the heart of the matter. You know, and I just finished reading all of Sam's books in the last couple of weeks, and as far as I'm concerned, he doesn't ever get to the bottom of the issue. He doesn't address the fundamental thinkers. There are some profound thinkers. Dostoevsky's one, Tolstoy, Nietzsche, Jung. It's like they're completely absent from, and the same with Dawkins. It's completely absent. All that conceptualization is completely absent from their corpus of works. They don't even have an understanding for the psychological utility of religion. And it's a big problem. You know, you don't get to be an atheist when the people you attack are like naive fundamentalists. And I have some sympathy for the naive fundamentalists. It's like what they're basically saying is something like this. Look, we have an ethos that's valuable. You scientist types are casually dismantling it. What the hell are we supposed to do? Well, the fundamentalists don't know what to do about that. So they say, well, creationism is science. It's like, well, no, it's not. But that doesn't mean that they don't have a point. Their point is there's something valuable here. It's like, don't break it casually. What are you going to replace it with? The new atheists wish that everybody becomes rational. It's like, yeah, sure, that's going to happen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Peterson. I'm a student of religious studies, and currently I'm writing an honors thesis on religious imagery in an Indo-Persian literary genre. There's a poet-philosopher who said the following, which I think you'll like, who, by the way, was a huge fan of Goethe. He said that in addressing God, he calls him the hidden reality, and he asks the hidden reality to reveal itself, but using the robe of metaphor, because he thinks that metaphor is the only way, stories are the only way that human beings can comprehend, the hidden reality. I know you've written a lot, you speak a lot about religious stories. I just wanted to ask you, although it may be a very broad question, what is the place of the religious in stories? And
religious is something like the grammatical structure of stories. Like if you go down and you look at what makes a story, that's religious. Yeah, it's not a story otherwise. Like a story is a particular sort of thing. Like in its simplest sense, a story is an account of how to get from point A to point B. It's like a map. But there's a value structure inherent in that, obviously, because otherwise you wouldn't go from point A to point B. So just to make the map means to adopt a value structure. But the story is actually more complicated than that, because as you move from point A to point B, processes of radical transformation are often necessary. And the deep stories about the processes of radical transformation that occur as you move from point A to B are basically, they're indistinguishable from religious stories. Now, I think the reason they tend to become religious, let's say, is because it has something to do with the gap between the finite and comprehensible and the infinite and incomprehensible. It's like we live in the finite and comprehensible, but we're surrounded by the infinite and incomprehensible, and there has to be a border between those, like a mediating border. That's poetry and art. That's narrative. That's religion. And it's that strange metaphorical reality, let's say, that's not factual and it's not comprehensible, but that's not infinitely incomprehensible either. It's a bridge between the two. So, and as you move closer to the infinite and incomprehensible across that bridge, you get farther and farther away from what you understand, right? But how could it be otherwise, given that you're finite, you are a finite being, surrounded by what's infinite and incomprehensible.
And that was his critique of the strict rationalists, that they can't, that it's hard for them to make this, that's where poets come in, and that's where artists come in. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, I learned a lot of this from Jung, because Jung's idea was that rationality is embedded in a dream. Like there's the infinite unknowable, and then there's the dream. And then inside the dream is the rational domain. And I believe that to be the case. Why else would we dream? We have to dream. If we don't dream, we go insane. It doesn't take very long. And so there's an element of poetic conceptualization that grounds us, and it has to be taken seriously. The rational critics of dreams think about them as random neural activity. It's like there's nothing when you look at a TV screen that's not on a channel, that's random. When you dream something complex and sophisticated, that's not random. So, yeah, so the metaphor surrounds us, let's say. And we can critique it rationally and we can undermine it, but there's real danger in that. So